There's a story buried in the shadows of England's castles that almost no one talks about. Not about King John. You've heard of him, the tyrant who lost Normandy and fought his own barons. No, this is about his daughter, a princess you were never supposed to know, a woman who was forced into a role so shocking, so dangerous, that her name became whispered like a warning, the siege bride. Imagine this, the walls of Dover Castle trembling under the thunder of siege engines. The greatest fortress in England, besieged by enemies who wanted the kingdom itself. And inside those walls, not just knights and captains, but a young woman, Eleanor, King John's daughter, given as part of a desperate gamble, a living pledge, a bargaining chip wrapped in silk, a princess turned into a weapon of war. They don't tell you this in the chronicles, but her life was not a fairy tale. It was betrayal, captivity, and survival at the heart of one of England's darkest hours. And the truth is stranger than any legend, because Eleanor's fate was not only about her. It was about the last gamble to save Dover, the last gamble to hold England itself. The year was 1216, and England was a kingdom on the edge of collapse. King John, hated by his barons, despised by the church, and cursed in the chronicles, had brought his realm to the brink of ruin. His failures had opened the gates to a foreign Prince Louis of France, who had crossed the Channel with an army, claiming the English crown for himself. London had already fallen. Many of the barons, furious with John's tyranny, had turned traitor and welcomed Louis as their rightful king. Castles across the country had either surrendered or were preparing to do so. And at the edge of the white cliffs of Dover, the strongest fortress in England became the last hope. Dover Castle was no ordinary fortress. Perched high above the sea, its walls thick and unyielding, its towers rising like teeth from the chalk cliffs, it was called the Key to England. Whoever held Dover held the realm, and John's enemies knew it. Prince Louis marched on the castle with siege engines, ladders, and fire, determined to break it open and claim victory. Inside, the defenders prepared for a fight that would decide more than just stone walls. They were fighting for the kingdom itself, and among them, placed not with sword or shield, but as something far stranger, was Eleanor, the daughter of King John. She had been raised not in splendor, but in the shadow of her father's turbulent reign. By 1216, Eleanor had seen enough of betrayal to know that in her world, being a princess was no shield. Daughters of kings were bargaining chips, their bodies and futures traded like coins in the game of power. And now, her life was about to be gambled in Dover. The chronicles say little of her feelings. But imagine the scene. A girl, no older than her late teens, walking through the echoing halls of Dover Castle as the walls shook with the impact of siege stones. Her footsteps rang against cold stone, her gown brushing against the floor, her heart pounding as she realized she was not just a daughter of John, she was leverage. A pawn. Her father had died in October of that year, leaving England to her young half-brother, the 9-year-old Henry III, with John gone. Loyalty was thin, the kingdom fractured. Dover's garrison, led by Hubert de Burgh, held out desperately, knowing that surrender would mean the crown falling to France. In that desperate defense, Eleanor became more than a bystander. She was placed in the balance, her fate tied to the survival of Dover itself. To the men who negotiated, she was a symbol. To Louis, she was a prize. To Hubert de Burgh, She was a weight of responsibility greater than any stone in Dover's walls. For to surrender Eleanor would mean handing over the daughter of a king, a token that could shift alliances and legitimize Louis's claim. To protect her meant holding out against odds so crushing that even the strongest walls might not stand. Imagine Eleanor at night, lying awake in a chamber deep within the castle, the distant thunder of siege engines rumbling through the stones, her candles flickering, shadows dancing across the mosaicked walls, her maidservants whispering prayers. Outside, men screamed and died, arrows whistled through the air, the sky lit by fire. And she, a princess, knew that her life was not her own. But what makes Eleanor's story so haunting is not just that she was there, it is that her fate was entwined with betrayal. When Dover finally negotiated terms, Eleanor became part of the bargain. She was not carried out in triumph. She was given away, a bride not by love, but by siege. A bride not to build peace, but to hold it hostage. They called her the siege bride, and her life from that moment was no longer her own. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The walls of Dover had withstood the hammering of French siege engines longer than anyone thought possible. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and the defenders, under the iron will of Hubert de Burgh, clung to the fortress with the desperation of men who knew the entire kingdom hung by a thread. But no wall can resist forever. The food stores dwindled, men bled in the breaches, and the noise of relentless bombardment haunted even the strongest heart. And so, finally, negotiation came. It was in those moments of desperate bargaining that Eleanor's fate was sealed. She was no ordinary hostage. She was the daughter of King John, a girl of royal blood, connected not only to England's throne, but to its legitimacy. For Prince Louis, son of the King of France, she was a treasure more valuable than gold. To possess Eleanor would mean more than ransom. It would mean a weapon, a princess who could be wed, controlled, and used as a living seal on his claim to the crown of England. We cannot know whether Eleanor understood the terms whispered in the smoky chambers of Dover, but one thing is certain. When the drawbridge was finally lowered, when Hubert de Burgh and the weary garrison agreed to terms that would allow them to keep the castle standing, Eleanor was among the pledges handed over to the French. She did not walk free. She walked into captivity. The chronicles are sparse, recording only the bare facts. But if we look closer, we can imagine the human cost. Eleanor, barely more than a girl, escorted under guard through the gates, the French banners snapping in the wind above her. Behind her, the cliffs of Dover, the fortress that had been her cage and her shield. Ahead of her, the encampment of her enemies, filled with men who cheered not for her, but for what she represented, victory over her father's bloodline. And then the whispers began. Eleanor would not remain a mere hostage. She would become the siege bride. Marriage in those days was never about love. It was politics, power, survival. To bind Eleanor to a French lord, or even to Prince Louis himself, would twist her identity into a weapon against her own kin. She was a daughter of England, but in French hands, she could be turned into a French queen, a puppet through which Louis could claim legitimacy over the English throne. Think of the weight on her shoulders. A girl raised to be her father's daughter, now forced to be the bride of her father's enemy. Every smile she gave, every word she spoke, every step she took would be measured and judged. Her body no longer her own, but a battlefield for crowns. We cannot know what Eleanor felt, but we can imagine the loss of her freedom, the humiliation of being paraded as a prize, the fear of being erased from her own story. And yet, in the fragments that survive, there is a glimmer of her strength. Eleanor endured. She survived captivity, survived the collapse of her father's realm, survived the bargain that made her the siege bride. But her survival came at a cost. When John had died, his 9-year-old son Henry became king. The boys, regents, desperate to hold England together, begged for peace. To secure that peace, Eleanor's fate was cemented. She was bound in marriage, not to a king, but to one of the Lord's chosen to keep her neutralized, her bloodline locked away from the struggle for power. Some sources whisper that she was given to William Marshall's kin, others that she was destined for a French alliance. The truth is tangled in the fog of history, but the result was the same. Eleanor was denied choice. Her marriage was not her victory, it was her prison. And yet imagine the scene. Eleanor, veiled in silk, standing at an altar, not as a bride of joy, but as a symbol of war. The hall filled not with music and laughter, but with murmurs of politics. Men eyed her, not with love but calculation. Her dowry was not jewels, but the surrender of Dover, the blood of English knights, the desperate gamble of her father's realm. They called her the siege bride because she was wedded not for her beauty, not for her heart, but because she was the price of survival when Dover's walls nearly fell. But here's the twist, though. Louis seemed victorious. Though Eleanor's fate seemed sealed, history had another plan. Within a year, Louis's fortunes turned. His baronial allies deserted him. His army weakened. And Hubert de Burgh, the man who had once given Eleanor up, rallied Dover to new defiance. Slowly, painfully, the tide turned, and Louis was forced to retreat. England would survive. The crown would pass to Henry III. The realm would rebuild. But what of Eleanor? She did not return to triumph. She did not become a heroine sung in ballads. She remained bound in the shadows, her life tied to men who used her name, her body, her bloodline for their cause. Her captivity had broken her freedom, and her marriage had silenced her. And yet, even in silence, her presence haunted the kingdom. She was a living reminder of John's tyranny, of Dover's gamble, of the cost of rebellion. A daughter of a hated king, a bride forged in siege, she became a ghost at the edge of history. Her story too dangerous to tell in full. But here we are, centuries later, uncovering it. Asterisk, asterisk. The sound of siege engines faded into memory. But for Eleanor, the echoes never truly stopped. She had been given away like coin at Dover, a princess bound in marriage, not by love or destiny, but by desperation. They called her the siege bride, and that name clung to her like chains. Her marriage was meant to erase her, to tuck her into the shadows of politics, to bury her under duties that left no space for ambition. The new regime, under her half-brother Henry III, could not afford a rival claimant lingering in the light. Eleanor, daughter of King John, granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, was too dangerous to be left unbound. So, her marriage became her prison. The man she was bound to was not a prince of power, but a choice of calculation. Some chronicles whisper it was William Marshall's kin. Others claim a loyalist baron who had proven himself at Dover. Whoever he was, By marrying her, her bloodline was folded safely into the king's faction, preventing Louis or any other rival from wielding her name. For Eleanor, this meant a life of shadows. She was no longer a bargaining chip on the battlefield, but a quiet piece on the board of dynastic politics. She bore children, managed estates, and played the role expected of a noblewoman. But beneath that silence, her identity as the siege bride haunted her. Imagine her walking through the halls of her husband's manor, tapestries whispering stories of conquest and faith, while her own story remained unspoken. Servants bowed, knights saluted, but behind their eyes, they remembered this was the girl given at Dover, the princess who had been bartered for survival. Her husband may have been loyal, but he was no equal to her spirit. Eleanor had grown up in the shadow of one of England's most infamous kings, had watched her father lose Normandy, fight barons, defy popes, and collapse under rebellion. She had walked Dover's battlements while stones thundered against its walls. She had been handed to enemies as a living pledge. A woman who had seen such storms could not easily be content with the quiet rhythm of household life. But the chronicles say nothing of her voice. They leave her silenced, a ghost between the lines. And perhaps that silence is the most telling. In an age where chroniclers rushed to record the deeds of men, Eleanor's absence speaks of how threatening she remained. To speak too loudly of the siege bride was to remind the world of England's fragility, of the moment when even Dover nearly fell. Her half-brother, Henry III, grew into his crown, ruling for decades, his reign long but troubled. Civil wars, baronial revolts, and foreign entanglements marked his years. And always in the background, the children of John remained figures of tension. Some, like Henry himself, were crowned and celebrated. Others, like Eleanor, were buried in obscurity. It was safer that way, and yet think of her resilience. She survived the venom that swallowed her father, survived the fall of Dover, survived captivity. That survival, in itself, was a defiance. She lived in a world determined to erase her, and still her story endured, whispered in chronicles, carried forward into legend. Imagine her in later years, standing in a cloistered garden, her children playing nearby. She watches them laugh, their voices mingling with the sound of church bells. Does she remember Dover then, the roar of battle, the terror of being marched into captivity? Does she whisper prayers of gratitude that her children are safe from such storms? Or does she feel bitterness, knowing that her life was not her own, that she was sacrificed so England might survive? We cannot know her thoughts, but we can feel the weight of her silence. Every noble duty she performed, every feast she hosted, every estate she managed was done under the shadow of her title, the siege bride. In the records, her later years blur. No triumphs, no scandals, no rebellions, just the slow fade of a woman buried under history's rubble. But the fact that her name still survives, Eleanor, daughter of King John, the siege bride of Dover, proves that she was never entirely erased. Her story lingered, too haunting to forget, and there is a final twist. Her bloodline did not vanish. Through her children and kin, Eleanor's legacy seeped into the veins of England. The very princess who had been given away to prevent claims became an ancestor to nobles who would shape the kingdom for centuries. What was meant to silence her instead echoed across generations. That is the paradox of Eleanor's life. She was sacrificed to save a fortress. She was bound to erase a threat, and yet her story remained. Dover's last gamble was not just a siege. It was a bargain that made her into a ghost haunting England's history. The years after Dover did not erase Eleanor. They buried her in silence. Yes, but silence is never empty. Silence is filled with whispers, and whispers can be more dangerous than screams. For Eleanor, those whispers became her shadow. She was no longer the terrified girl handed through the gates of Dover Castle, nor the reluctant bride exchanged like coin in a bargain. She was a woman now, and with that came something far more dangerous than innocence. She remembered everything: the thunder of siege stones, the weight of her father's failures, the humiliation of being given away, the icy stares of French lords who measured her not as a person but as a weapon. And memory, in the medieval world, was power. The chroniclers did not write of her openly, but in the spaces between their lines we can sense her presence. Eleanor's name flickered like candlelight, often blurred, often avoided, but never entirely gone. Why? Because she was dangerous. She carried in her veins the blood of King John and Eleanor of Aquitaine, two of the most infamous rulers of their age. She was tied to the Plantagenet line, a family cursed by ambition and betrayal. Even in obscurity, she was a reminder of how fragile the throne of England had been. Imagine her in her 30s, walking through the cloisters of a monastery where she sometimes found refuge, hood drawn low, her eyes tracing the carvings on the stone. Behind her, whispers trailed like shadows. That is the siege bride. The words never left her. Wherever she went, they followed. Not Eleanor the mother, not Eleanor the wife, not Eleanor the devout, always Eleanor, the girl bartered at Dover. And the whispers grew darker still. Enemies of her family painted her as cursed, a woman whose very presence brought ruin. They whispered that she had been a bad omen in the siege, that her marriage was barren of joy, that her silence meant guilt. These rumors were not truth, but truth mattered little. Rumors could destroy reputations, warp legacies, and reduce lives into cautionary tales. Yet Eleanor endured. She lived, she bore children, she maintained her estates, she played the role demanded of her. But beneath it all, she carried that other identity, one she had not chosen, but could never escape. The siege bride. Her brother, Henry III, reigned on. His rule tested by barons and battles, his throne secure only through constant negotiation. And still, Eleanor lived in the shadows of his court, never allowed to near, never allowed to shine. She was not imprisoned in a cell, but in something subtler, a life deliberately crafted to keep her harmless. And yet, legends began to weave around her. Some said she remained haunted by Dover, that she would wake screaming in the night, hearing again the thunder of siege engines. Others claimed she had grown cold and calculating, her silence masking a mind sharper than any blade. A few whispered that she secretly plotted, waiting for a moment when her children could rise, when her bloodline could claim what she had been denied. History gives us no proof of these whispers, but their very existence tells us how Eleanor was seen, not just as a forgotten princess, but as a dangerous one. And perhaps that was her victory. Though her enemies had sought to erase her, they could not. Though they had silenced her, her legend still grew, to be remembered as cursed, as dangerous, as haunted. These were not the memories of a pawn. They were the marks of a queen in exile, a woman too powerful to vanish entirely. Imagine her, in her later years, standing in a great hall during a feast, her children grown round her. The minstrels sing of knights and kings, but when her name is spoken, the hall still hushes. Servants glance at her sideways, remembering the tales their mothers told. This is the princess who was given at Dover. This is the siege bride, and in that hush, Eleanor might smile. For even if her enemies had tried to bury her, even if she had been silenced, she was still feared, still remembered. Her story is a ghost story, but not of chains and rattling bones. It is the ghost of power denied, the ghost of memory carried in silence, the ghost of a woman too dangerous to be forgotten. By the time her life neared its end, Eleanor had become more legend than woman. The records fade, but the whispers sharpen. Some said she retired to a convent, living her last years among prayers and cloisters. Others claimed she remained in the estates of her husband, guiding her children with a quiet strength. Still others suggested she died quietly, her name erased from the chronicles by those who feared her bloodline might rise again. But one truth remains: she never escaped Dover, whether in cloisters or halls, whether in whispers or silence. She was always remembered as the princess who was handed away under the shadow of siege towers, the bride who symbolized England's desperation. That memory became her legend, the siege bride, a name meant to shame her, yet one that has outlasted her enemies. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest wounds, but it never erased Eleanor, though the chronicles reduced her to a footnote. Though kings and courtiers worked to bury her name, the echoes of the siege bride survived. She became less a woman of flesh and blood, and more a story whispered across generations. Her life turned into a lesson, a warning, a shadow stretching over England's history. By the time Eleanor reached her later years, the world around her had changed. Her brother Henry III had grown old, his long reign marred by civil war and rebellion. England was not the kingdom it had been when Dover's walls trembled beneath French siege engines. New heirs ruled, new barons schemed, and yet Eleanor remained a survivor, a living relic of John's cursed line, a reminder of the moment when England almost slipped away. Imagine her in old age, seated in a quiet manor, her hair silvered, her children now grown into lords and ladies of their own. The halls echoed with new voices, but when she entered, the room still hushed. Even in her final decades, the name clung, the siege bride, for the servants who whispered her story, for the villagers who gossiped of the noblewoman in the hall. Eleanor was not just a lady of estates. She was the princess who had once been bartered like coin, the girl who had walked out of Dover's gates into the arms of her father's enemies. And yet, within that title, there was power. The siege bride was no longer a pawn to those who spoke of her. She was a figure of fascination, a woman whose endurance defied the centuries. Children of nobles grew up hearing tales of her captivity, her forced marriage, her silence. To some, she was a tragic heroine. To others, a cursed omen. To a few, she was a survivor, a symbol of how, even when women were silenced, their stories refused to die. Her legacy was not carved in stone monuments or grand tombs. It was carried in whispers, in rumors, in the subtle ways her story wove itself into England's fabric. Chroniclers avoided her, but poets hinted at her. Families who descended from her bloodline carried the weight of her memory. Dover itself bore her ghost, the walls scarred by siege, still echoing with the unspoken truth that within its towers a princess had been gambled like a coin in England's last desperate hour. And in those echoes, Eleanor lived on. Consider the irony. Her father, King John, was remembered as one of the worst kings of England, tyrant, oathbreaker, coward. His son Henry III ruled for decades, yet was plagued by rebellion and overshadowed by his son Edward I. But Eleanor, the daughter intended to be forgotten, outlived them all in legend. Not in chronicles, not in ballads, but in the murmurs of people who could not let go of her story. Because the siege bride embodied something universal. She was a symbol of sacrifice, of betrayal, of survival in the face of forces far greater than herself. She reminded people of the price women paid for the ambitions of men, and she reminded them of the fragility of kingdoms, how even the strongest walls Dover's white cliffs were not enough without desperate gambles. Her death came quietly. No drums, no banners, no grand funeral. Perhaps she passed in her manor, surrounded by family. Perhaps she entered a convent in her last years, choosing prayer over politics. The records do not say, but even in death she was not erased. Her story clung like ivy to Dover's walls, to England's memory, to the line of Plantagenets that followed. We uncover what the chronicles tried to hide, that Eleanor was more than a pawn. She was the proof that survival itself is a kind of victory. She endured captivity, betrayal, and silence, and still her name outlasted the men who sought to bury it. The siege bride, a name that was meant to shame her, but became her crown. Think of her one last time, a young woman walking out of Dover's gates as catapults thundered. Her gown brushing the dirt, her face pale but unbroken. Around her, soldiers jeered and banners snapped, but she kept her head high. That moment, captured in the memory of those who saw it, has echoed for 8 centuries. She was not the Queen England expected. She was not even the bride she might have chosen. But she became something far more enduring, a story. And stories, once loosed into the world, are impossible to silence. Eleanor, daughter of John, Princess of England, the siege bride of Dover, her walls still stand, and so does her memory.